Howdy, welcome to Coach Cloker's Classroom, and today we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement in American history. So, first off, going back before the movement began, it starts with the Supreme Court case hearing Plessy versus Ferguson, which is going to establish the precedent of separate but equal. The idea that African Americans and white Americans will have separate facilities, each will be equal in their funding and quality. This idea isn't going to be extreme in the notion it's going to be passed 8-1 in the Supreme Court. Only Supreme Court Justice John Harlan is going to argue that the Constitution is colorblind. And this is going to set the precedent for how society in the United States abides by the law and how they act culturally until the late 50s, early 60s. It's going to lead way for progressives like W.E.B. Du Bois to create the NAACP, an organization meant to support African Americans at this time, have legal protection. Modern day, they now provide scholarships for many African Americans looking to go to college. And so if you are a junior or senior in college, you might want to look at the NAACP or LULAC for a potential scholarship. So after World War II, Americans will be returning. Many African Americans and whites will have been working side by side during World War II. And Truman is going to act in several ways to try and remove the barriers of segregation as best he can in the early 50s. 11 states will pass laws banning discrimination in jobs and public facilities. By 1952, 20% of Southern blacks are registered to vote, and there were no lynchings reported, which is remarkable for the time. This is still a time where we have literacy tests and other laws holding back African Americans from voting. And we get cultural icons like Jackie Robinson who come to the forefront, leading the way for African Americans in sports, playing in the major leagues. And of course, we also have Ernie Davis, who will go on a few years later to win the first Heisman Trophy in American college football. So, with Truman calling for the government to end segregation and ensure equal treatment in housing, unemployment laws, education, Truman will become less and less popular among Southern whites. He will call for permanent bans and national laws against lynching and poll taxes and other laws which will hold back African Americans in society. And so, as his campaign kicks off for re-election, he is also going to pass Executive Order 9981, which will ban discrimination in the armed forces. Schools in the U.S., however, will still be segregated. In the South, Jim Crow is going to be having a massive power struggle over the laws. Many white Americans in the South did not feel any urgency or need to confront the racial inequalities, especially in the South. And furthermore, as we've talked about in the past with Plessy versus Ferguson, Hispanics and the Asian populations in the United States have always found themselves in a undefined gray zone, not able to be given access to the facility of the whites in many cases, and not allowed to use the facilities of African Americans. We will get a Supreme Court case before and the early days of the Civil Rights era, Mendez versus Westminster, where California will outlaw segregation for Latinos, thus giving Latinos full access to white facilities in the state of California. And the governor who's going to sign it is going to be future Justice Earl Warren, who believes that the inequality is not meant for the United States. It has no place in the United States. Marching on in time, the NAACP, as we've talked about, created by W.E. Du Bois, led by Thurgood Marshall, is going to challenge the Plessy versus Ferguson in a very famous court case known as Brown versus the Board of Education. The official title, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And so in this court case, the argument was that Mr. Brown wanted to send his daughter to a school that was less than a mile away from his current home. It was very close. It was a well school, academically speaking, but because he was an African American, he had to send his child 8 miles across town with no public busing, across railroad tracks, across dangerous areas, in order to get his child to school. And so it didn't make any sense to send his daughter across town to go to school when there was a closer school literally walking distance from his door. And so the new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, is going to be able to hear this court case. And while they are going to push to end segregation and integrate schools, many of them are afraid, though, that it is going to lead to violence in the United States. Once they end segregation with Brown versus the Board of Education, it's still going to take a long time, several years, for schools in the United States to be desegregated. And so, continuing with desegregation of schools, they'll pass the first laws that will prohibit states from implementing what are deemed as racist policies to deny African Americans voting, such as the grandfather clause or literacy test. And it's going to be met with some serious backlash, specifically by the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, who's going to prevent 9 African American students from attending Little Rock Central High School. There were 9 African Americans who are now going to be attending what was an all-white school. And so using the police force and the National Guard to literally stand and block these students from entering school, the President Eisenhower, succeeding President Truman, is going to come in and use the military to not only break this blockade of the school and allow these 9 students to attend high school, but to also protect them inside the school. And so it was a serious power move by the United States to show that they weren't going to just openly allow someone to defy President Truman's orders and the Supreme Court overturning Plessy versus Ferguson and ending segregation. They weren't going to allow someone to openly say no and continue to segregate at this time. And so with integration, African American students and white students attending the same school, while it will be slow, many African Americans will still be attending schools because they will begin what we'll call red zoning these schools into making sure that certain schools have specific demographics, which is a continuation of discrimination in the United States. Another politician who is going to be against integrating school is Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who made his speech saying, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And this was in response to African Americans being accepted into the University of Alabama. Now, this is after the Little Rock Nine. This is during the term of President Kennedy. And so, once again, President Kennedy will use the precedent set by Eisenhower, and he will send in 100 troops, effectively forcing Governor Wallace and the local police to allow these students to attend university. And this movement is picking up steam. Many of the well-known and beloved characters in American history we will have during this time, Rosa Parks being one of them. We've all heard the story growing up that she was a seamstress who got off work and refused to give up her seat in the front of the bus to a white passenger. Now, there's a little bit more to the story than just that. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott was planned and staged on in the sense that Rosa Parks was working with civil rights activists beforehand, and it was planned that she was going to sit in the front of the bus and refuse to give up her seat because they wanted to show how extreme these laws were, how unjust and unfair these laws were. And also, Rosa Parks had never been arrested or was known as a civil rights activist to anyone in Alabama at that time. And so having a fresh face and a relatable person in charge and being the image for this was great for the civil rights movement. And so with Rosa Parks getting arrested because she refused to give up her seat, the Montgomery bus boycott is going to begin. And so for 381 days, over a year, African Americans are going to walk, carpool, take taxis, and by all means avoid taking public transportation using the bus system until the Supreme Court or any court in that state would rule it as unconstitutional. And so the Montgomery bus system lost about 80% of its revenue during those days during the boycott. We also have beloved leaders of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, who is going to push the nonviolent crusade through Southern churches. He is going to be a great speaker and well known for his ability to inspire in his speeches during the time, taking inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence and civil disobedience. He's going to use this philosophy of you must beat hate with love, because if a protest was to turn violent, it'll just continue to escalate on both sides. And so after the boycott, he will lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is a coalition of Black ministers, Black church leaders, and civil rights activists who are fighting for desegregation. Southern states will begin to refuse to uphold the integration laws set by Brown versus the Board of Education. They will continue to deny African Americans the right to education and to vote, and it is becoming more and more standoffish during the 1960s. And so an example of that is that in every southern state, only 2 southern senators refused to do it, but most of the southern senators signed a document effectively saying they were going to refuse, slow down, and abuse the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education in any way possible. This also led to another famous organization, the Snick, which we will talk about in a little bit, led by African American college students who were known for attending lunch at restaurants, sitting in the whites only section, and then refusing to leave until either the store closed or they would be served. And this would continue for several months throughout cities and towns And it is going to once again become a hallmark of using nonviolent civil disobedience to show the injustices of segregation. We continue with Snick and Ella Baker, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and core of the Congress of Racial Equality are going to push for freedom rides, once again with the pushing for the ban of segregation on public transportation. Many African Americans and white civil rights activists from the northern states are going to travel to what is known as the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and push for ending segregation of transportation, push for the end of literacy tests, and many of the public policies of segregation in those states. They will be met with violence in the southern states. There are many records of people coming on freedom rides and then being met by angry mobs with baseball bats as they get off the bus. And so it'll take several deaths before the US government is going to step in and say, enough is enough. We need to end the violence. And so the height comes in 1963 with President Kennedy's term. Martin Luther King is going to be arrested in the city of Birmingham. He was there as many African Americans were being targeted in bombings and shootings and attacks. And so while he was there and arrested in jail for his what the city called illegal acts in protest, he is going to write his letter from Birmingham Jail, which will become a very famous letter in American history. We read it in US history. We also read it in English. A very famous letter that he's going to write at this time, talking about the abuses that blacks will face in the South. And so with this, Martin Luther King is going to push to continue to show the violent culture in the South of the time towards African Americans. He's going to push and have African Americans send their children onto the streets with them protesting. And the police chief is going to go berserk, for lack of a better term. He's going to unleash police dogs, water cannons, riot police on protesters who are mostly children at several particular ones. And all this is going to be done with the news camera crew sitting 3 feet away watching children being beat, attacked by dogs, hosed by a fire hose, which is very painful. And not only is it going to ruin his image and the city's image, it is going to push for now people throughout the nation calling for them to resign and for the desegregation of the cities. There's going to continue to be violence in the South, with children being either attacked by being shot or by someone setting off a bomb or throwing a bomb, trying to intimidate and scare the black community. And so as the time progresses, the leaders of the civil rights movement are going to push and create the March on Washington to have a public show with the seat of Congress and the president. And this is where Martin Luther King is going to give his I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. And so this is going to be nationally televised. It's going to be widely published. And it's going to be one of those few moments where America is going to straighten up and think, yes, this is the final push for the Civil Rights Act, for trying to bring equality to the United States. And so Kennedy is going to be occupied in other affairs at this time, with the civil rights going on, where he is also dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's going to be hard for him to go back and forth balancing several issues. However, when Kennedy is pushing for the Civil Rights Act and banning discrimination in public places, he's going to be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald before that law is passed. Lee Harvey Oswald will then be shot by local nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who will be called an American hero by many, and he will live out his life comfortably in a prison cell for killing Lee Harvey Oswald. But with Kennedy being assassinated, this meant that the control of the government fell on a now and born Texan, Lyndon B. Johnson. Growing up in the poor hill country, Johnson City will soon be named after him. President Johnson will also have experience teaching in poor schools in Texas, teaching poor whites and poor Mexican children. And so, taking from his time as a teacher and the ideas of FDR's and the government's obligation to help in the New Deal with the Great Depression, living through this, he is going to call for the Civil Rights Act of 1864 and many other laws using the same philosophy. This will ban racial discrimination in jobs, in public places, and accommodations. It'll ban discrimination based off sex, so you can't discriminate between men or women. And as he signs this, he knows Southern whites are going to be angry, and he knows that the other party at the time, the Republican Party, is going to be able to take up the banner of anti-integration, pro-segregation at the time. And so the parties won't flip right away, but with LBJ now as president, it's not going to fully end segregation and the inequalities in the southern states. Many states will still take active measures to deny African Americans the right to integration. The right to vote will be denied to African Americans. And so hundreds of young students and young men and women are going to flock to Mississippi to register to vote, only to be met by violence, crowds with baseball bats, much like the Freedom Riders were met with violence. 3 young activists are going to be murdered, 2 white and 1 black, by the KKK at that time. The brother of JFK, Robert Kennedy, is going to order an investigation. And so, as they are searching the swamps for the bodies of these 3 young activists, they're going to find 8 African Americans in hidden graves in the swamps and find their bodies before they will find the 3 activists. And so the last push for the civil rights movement comes in 1965. MLK is going to be in Alabama, pushing for African Americans to register to vote, pushing to end the laws such as literacy test for prohibiting poor whites and African Americans from being able to vote. This will be the famous march across the Selma Bridge, famously portrayed in the movie Selma. And once again, It'll be televised worldwide with camera crews 3 feet away. LBJ, seeing this and this march getting national attention, he's going to ask Congress to officially pass a law banning measures preventing people from voting, the 24th Amendment specifically, which will outlaw poll tax, outlaw the grandfather clause and literacy test, saying that you're not going to have to pass a IQ test or have to pay in order to vote, which were just some of the measures used by southern states at the time. And so the first violent uprisings occur in 1864 between blacks and white police in Harlem. Years later, the city of Los Angeles will erupt in violence between African Americans and white police and white businesses. And so President Johnson is going to take and appoint a commission to try and find what was causing the violence. And it's pretty simple. It was the segregation of African Americans and whites and the massive poverty rates among African Americans. Example, African Americans were twice as likely to be unemployed as white Americans, and their income was about half. On the other end of the spectrum from MLK, we get Malcolm X, who is very much like the Booker T. Washington of the time, being a key leader for the civil rights movement, being able to communicate effectively, and pushing for African Americans to rely on their own resources, create their own economy, and basically have equality through economic independence. But MLK also was willing to use violence for most of his time as a civil rights leader. Now he will encounter the Nation of Islam, and on the Hajj, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, the pillar that says you must make once in your life, if you're able, a trip to Mecca to pray at the Kaaba. On the return from his trip, he is going to start pushing for nonviolence, and this is going to lead to him not only becoming more popular with the civil rights activists and whites who are advocating for Martin Luther King and the nonviolence method, he's going to become unpopular with those that want to use violence or were willing to use violence. And so he'll be assassinated in 1965. And so Malcolm X is not as widely taught or as popular as Martin Luther King because there are effectively two parts to his movement. There was the first, which was have your own control of politics and resources, your own nation, and use violence, opposed to the nonviolence. We need to push for political equality. And so Malcolm X is going to be seen as the father for the Black Power movement. The idea that blacks were colonized by people, and the only way to regain that freedom was to be won through a revolution. This is in the first half when he will call to use violence. He will help lead the creation of the Black Panther movement, a paramilitary group pushing for African Americans to have protection from the police. They will run health clinics, they'll run schools, breakfast programs, they'll push for African Americans and civil rights activists to be released from jail, but they're also willing to use violence if they feel threatened. And so there's several records of shootouts between the Black Panther movement and police throughout the United States. Many argue um, about what was the intent of the Black Panther movement. And so 1968 rolls around with MLK now pushing for the assistance in helping poverty and trying to end poverty in the United States, much like Lyndon B. Johnson made a committee to look at the cause for the violence, and they said it was segregation and poverty. Yes, passing laws to end segregation will be one thing, but you still have the other end of the stick, which was poverty. And so when he's going to Memphis, he'll be assassinated by a man whose name is James Earl Ray, who will have escaped from prison about 2 days before he's going to assassinate Martin Luther King. There is a few records of how it happened, but many people still debate the details of how Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so with Martin Luther King's death, we see the greatest outbreak of violence, as most African American neighborhoods will be in shock and in great sadness of the death of a very popular leader in the United States. Robert Kennedy, who is the brother of JFK, is going to decide he's going to try and run for president. And as he gives a speech and is leaving, he'll be assassinated by a man, Sirhan Sirhan, who many people argued he was brainwashed, but that is neither confirmed. Many people just argue that he disagreed with Kennedy and assassinated him. And so with Martin Luther King having been assassinated, Malcolm X been assassinated, Robert Kennedy been assassinated, John F. Kennedy assassinated. Violence is widely on the news, and people are still fighting back against the end of segregation, the start of integration. They're still pushing back against the Civil Rights Act because there's not one official leader leading the movement. And so we see another man by the name of Lester Maddox, who is a restaurant owner, and he is going to push and close his restaurant rather than ending segregation in his restaurant. He will run for governor in 1966. He will win, shockingly, and he's going to be so spiteful that he is not going to allow Martin Luther King's body to lie in the Georgia State Capitol building after his assassination, when they took his body on a tour through the United States so people could pay their respects and mourn. We don't just see the movement for African Americans in the Civil Rights Movement, we see it for Hispanics in the United States as well. The Chicano movement, putting pride in Mexican culture in the United States. Famous leader Cesar Chavez, very well known, very well portrayed in modern media, pushing for nonviolent protest and better working condition for Latinos and Mexican Americans working in the United States. He's also going to push and create the United Farm Workers, the UFW, which will be a union for those workers. We mentioned them briefly at the time. We get more another civil rights group that we've talked about briefly and has their origins at this time is Hector P. Garcia pushing the American GI Forum, trying to better the life of Mexican Americans leaving the military. And we get the League of United Latin American Citizens in the United States, also known as LULAC. And so this is created here in Texas, just down the road in Corpus Christi. And they're going to push to provide many services to Latinos in the United States as the NAACP did. We see women having a civil rights movement with Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, okay, pushing to say that middle class women were very discontent with the traditional roles of women at the time, felt that many women were trapped in a world where if a woman wasn't married, many people did not see her as valuable. She will help create the National Organization for Women, which is going to demand equal opportunity in jobs and education, and of course, in politics. So, with LBJ pushing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and being the successor to John F. Kennedy, he is going to win in a landslide election over Barry Goldwater in 1964. Okay, Barry Goldwater was Republican at the time. He was helped by many people in politics today. Hillary Clinton was what was known as a Goldwater girl and worked on the Barry Goldwater campaign. And so LBJ pushing the end of segregation is very popular, not only continuing the idea of making Kennedy a martyr for civil rights, he's going to continue pushing the idea of having a progressive government in the eyes of FDR, where the government has responsibility to the American citizens. He's going to create Medicare for elderly and Medicaid for lower income Americans. He's going to pump millions of dollars into education, into better schoolings. And so he wants to push an idea known as the Great Society, which is the response that we need to expand and make more money, and we're not going to solve poverty by limiting production. We need to trade, we need to make things, we need to sell things, and this is what's going to make money and end poverty. So his war on poverty is the centerpiece for the Great Crusade. They estimated 45 million Americans lived in poverty at the time. His Great Society is going to include things like food stamps, Head Start, which is a pre-K style education program for lower income Americans. He's going to create Sesame Street, as he knows that many children in the United States are not going to have access to education. And so he'll also create Vista, a domestic version of the Peace Corps. But one thing that people don't realize is when he created the idea of Sesame Street, there's so much psychology that went into it of how everyone in Sesame Street is a male, for example. And part of that was there was a belief that many young men in urban areas at that time, white, black, and Hispanic, did not have any great male role models. And so the idea of creating everyone on a TV show that would help teach education, teach the basics that children needed to have a head start in school, they would also have an idea of a male role model, which is quite crazy to think about that it was not that long ago when all this happened. All right, that's it for this time. Come back and join us when we start talking about the Vietnam War. Thanks for stopping by Coach Clucker's Classroom. Have a great day. Until then, I love you and I'm proud of you.